Skeleton Lake, an episode in camp, by Algernon Blackwood. The utter loneliness of our moose camp on Skeleton Lake had impressed us from the beginning. In the Quebec backwoods, 5 days by trail and canoe from civilization, and perhaps the singular name, contributed a little to the sensation of eeriness that made itself felt in the camp circle, when once the sun was down, and the late October mists began rising from the lake and winding their way in among the tree trunks. For in these regions all names of lakes and hills and islands have their origin in some actual event, taking either the name of a chief participant, such as Smith's Ridge, or claiming a place in the map by perpetuating some special feature of the journey or the scenery, such as Long Island, Deep Rapids, or Rainy Lake. All names thus have their meaning and are usually pretty recently acquired, while the majority are self-explanatory and suggest human and pioneer relations. Skeleton Lake, therefore, was a name full of suggestion, and though none of us knew the origin or the story of its birth, we all were conscious of a certain lugubrious atmosphere that haunted its shores and islands, and but for the evidences of recent moose tracks in its neighborhood, we should probably have pitched our tents elsewhere. For several 100 miles in any direction, we knew of only one other party of whites. They had journeyed up on the train with us, getting in at North Bay, and hailing from Boston Way. A common goal and object had served by way of introduction, but the acquaintance had made little progress. This noisy, aggressive Yankee did not suit our fancy as much as a possible neighbor, and it was only a slight intimacy between his chief guide, Jake the Swede, and one of our men that kept the thing going at all. They went into camp on Beaver Creek, 50 miles and more to the west of us. But that was 6 weeks ago, and seemed as many months, for days and nights pass slowly in these solitudes, and the scale of time changes wonderfully. Our men always seemed to know by instinct pretty well whar them other fellows was movin', but in the interval no one had come across their trails or once so much as heard their rifle shots. Our little camp consisted of the professor, his wife, a splendid shot and keen woodswoman, and myself. We had a guide apiece, and hunted daily in pairs from before sunrise till dark. It was our last evening in the woods, and the professor was lying in my little wedge tent, discussing the dangers of hunting alone in couples in this way. The flap of the tent hung back and let in fragrant odors of cooking over an open wood fire. Everywhere there were bustle and preparation, and one canoe already lay packed with moose horns, her nose pointing southwards. "If an accident happened to one of them," he was saying, "the survivor's story when he returned to camp would be entirely unsupported evidence, wouldn't it? Because, you see," and he went on laying down the law after the manner of professors, until I became so bored that my attention began to wander to pictures and memories of the scenes we were just about to leave. Garden Lake, with its 100 islands, the rapids out of Round Pond, the countless vistas of forest, crimson and gold in the autumn sunshine, and the starlit nights we had spent watching in cold, cramped positions for the wary moose on lonely lakes among the hills. The hum of the professor's voice in time grew more soothing. A nod or a grunt was all the reply he looked for. Fortunately, he loathed interruptions. I think I could almost have gone to sleep under his very nose. Perhaps I did sleep for a brief interval. Then it all came about so quickly, and the tragedy of it was so unexpected and painful, throwing our peaceful camp into momentary confusion, that now it all seems to have happened with the uncanny swiftness of a dream. First there was the abrupt ceasing of the droning voice, and then the running of quick little steps over the pine needles, and the confusion of men's voices, and the next instant the professor's wife was at the tent door, hatless, her face white, her hunting bloomers bagging at the wrong places, a rifle in her hand, and her words running into one another anyhow. "Quick, Harry! It's Rushton! I was asleep and it woke me. Something's happened. You must deal with it." In a second we were outside the tent with our rifles. "My God!" I heard the professor exclaim, as if he had first made the discovery. "It is Rushton!" I saw the guides helping, dragging a man out of a canoe. A brief space of deep silence followed, in which I heard only the waves from the canoe washing up on the sand, and then, immediately after, came the voice of a man talking with amazing rapidity and with odd gaps between his words. It was Rushton telling his story, and the tones of his voice, now whispering, now almost shouting, mixed with sobs and solemn oaths and frequent appeals to the deity, somehow or other struck the false note at the very start, and before any of us guessed or knew anything at all, something moved secretly between his words, a shadow veiling the stars, destroying the peace of our little camp, and touching us all personally with an undefinable sense of horror and distrust. I can see that group to this day, with all the detail of a good photograph, standing halfway between the firelight and the darkness, a slight mist rising from the lake, the frosty stars, and our men, in silence that was all sympathy, dragging Rushton across the rocks towards the campfire. Their moccasins crunched on the sand and slipped several times on the stones beneath the weight of the limp, exhausted body, and I can still see every inch of the pared cedar branch he had used for a paddle on that lonely and dreadful journey. But what struck me most, as it struck us all, was the limp exhaustion of his body compared to the strength of his utterance and the tearing rush of his words. A vigorous driving power was there at work, forcing out the tale, red-hot and throbbing, full of discrepancies and the strangest contradictions, and the nature of this driving power I first began to appreciate when they had lifted him into the circle of firelight, and I saw his face, grey under the skin, terror in his eye, tears too, hair and beard awry, and listened to the wild stream of words pouring forth without ceasing. I think we all understood then, but it was only after many years that anyone dared to confess what he thought. There was Matt Morris, my guide, Silver Fizz, whose real name was unknown, and who bore the title of his favorite drink, and huge Hank Milligan, all ears and kind intention, and there was Rushton, pouring out his ready-made tale, with ever-shifting eyes turning from face to face, seeking confirmation of details none had witnessed but himself, and one other. Silver Fizz was the first to recover from the shock of the thing, and to realize, with the natural sense of chivalry common to most genuine backwoodsmen, that the man was at a terrible disadvantage. At any rate, he was the first to start putting the matter to rights. "Never mind telling it just now," he said in a gruff voice, but with real gentleness. "Get a bite to eat first, and then let her go afterwards. Better have a horn of whiskey, too. It ain't all packed yet, I guess." "Couldn't eat or drink a thing," cried the other. "Good Lord, don't you see, man? I want to talk to someone first. I want to get it out of me to someone who can answer. I've had nothing but trees to talk with for 3 days, and I can't carry it alone any longer. Those cursed silent trees. I've told it 'em 1,000 times. Now, just see here, it was this way. When we started out from camp—" He looked fearfully about him, and we realized it was useless to stop him. The story was bound to come, and come it did. Now, the story itself was nothing out of the way. Such tales are told by the dozen round any campfire, where men who have knocked about in the woods are in the circle. It was the way he told it that made our flesh creep. He was near the truth all along, but he was skimming it, and the skimming took off the cream that might have saved his soul. Of course, he smothered it in words. Odd words, too, melodramatic, poetic, out-of-the-way words that lie just on the edge of frenzy. Of course, too, he kept asking us each in turn, scanning our faces with those restless, frightened eyes of his, "What would you have done? What else could I do?" And, "Was that my fault?" But that was nothing, for he was no milk-and-water fellow who dealt in hints and suggestions. He told his story boldly, forcing his conclusions upon us as if we had been so many wax cylinders of a phonograph that would repeat accurately what had been told us.